My shop got smoked by a tornado, so I'm building a custom piece of furniture in the backyard of my short-term rental. Step 1, we need a workbench. Finest work. Let me tell you about how I found myself here. My wife and I went to the hospital 4 months ago to have our very first baby, and not 30 minutes after we left, a tornado came through our neighborhood, hit our house and my shop, leaving us semi-homeless. That's how I ended up in the backyard of the short-term rental, but that first one allegedly had bed bugs, so that's not ideal, but we move on to a new backyard for this video. You saw some little snippets of the final product in the intro of this video, and because of that, you'll know that I just need some big old hunks of wood. And first up is to glue up a bunch of panels. So I'm moving on to jointing boards by hand, which is something that I've never done before. And I'm not gonna say it was totally easy, but it was easier than I thought it was. Now, I am a woodworking YouTuber, so when life hands me lemons, I naturally build a bench in the backyard. And that's the type of content that you're here for, I'm guessing, so I won't bore you with the whole details of my life over the past 4 months, but if you're feeling nosy and just want to be entertained by somebody else's problems, I will pin a comment at the top of the comment section giving all the juicy little details. Between the bench top and the base, I ended up doing, I believe it was 5 different panel glue-ups like this, but we're going to skip over that because that's boring and move on to actually carving the base. The reason that these panels are all a different size is to really just minimize the waste and make the carving portion of this build much easier. If you're watching this video, I don't want you getting the wrong idea that this is a minimal tools build. In fact, it's the exact opposite. I'm using every single tool at my disposal in this backyard. So yeah, I use my planer to get these down to size a little bit. I use my miter saw that I was able to fish out of storage. I'm using everything that I got here, folks. And to be honest, that's needed because I am an intermediate woodworker at best. You obviously can't tell over video, but this was in the middle of the Arkansas summer, so it was like 95 degrees and brutally humid. So I elected to do these glue-ups in 2 different stages rather than trying to do every single piece all at once. And that was for the best because I struggled just to get this portion done, and that's only half of the base unit itself. It's still rough, but you can actually start to see the vision of what this base is gonna look like, and I'm liking it a lot. I typically lean towards a very clean, contemporary build style for most of my pieces, and that was going to be very difficult to achieve in a backyard, so I actually chose the design of this piece for a very specific reason. We'll see later on if this is true, but my whole thought process was that a curved base would add some intrigue, but also at the same time be able to help me hide some mistakes. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect in order for it to look really good. My second approach is basically just buying the wow factor, which you'll see later on. This will be my first attempt at power carving, and frankly, it is a skill that I've put off for a while because I've been pretty scared to try it. Not scared as in like I'm gonna mess up the piece, but more so scared that I'm gonna lose a finger in the process. If you ever want to give yourself nightmares, go on Amazon and read the reviews for cheap power carving discs. It is enough to scare anybody. I really didn't want to go to the ER, so I ended up choosing this high-quality, American-made Kutzall carving disc, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out, but it made this process a breeze. It was super easy to control, and I mean, it's going to last forever because it's carbide. As I was carving, I was using my guidelines from the template and checking for flatness throughout to make sure that I wasn't getting off course. The power carving was going great, but one thing that I was not prepared for is just the sickening amount of dust that this was creating, and the fact that I was standing downwind, so it was literally all going onto my face. If you've ever thought about getting into woodworking, let this be your warning. It's not all that it's cracked up to be. Sometimes you'll have walnut sawdust literally stuck in your ears. With both sides of the base carved and complete, it was time to move on to hand sanding to actually get that final shape honed in. I thought I was making it easier on myself by choosing a hand-carved base, and in some ways it was, but also creating big, consistent curves like this is actually pretty difficult and requires a lot of work in just hand sanding, rasps, just trying to get this fully dialed in to be actually perfect. Perfect is probably too strong a word. I really just want it to look good. I guess I'll finish sanding tomorrow. I can't say that I'm used to rain delays in my woodworking projects, but there's a lot of firsts on this one, so fortunately we were able to get that sanding done the very next day. The bench top was glued up along with all of our other panels at the beginning of the video, but there's a little bit of work that needed done on it in order to get it looking right. The first step was to address this ugly knot hole right on the top of the bench. It would honestly be much easier just to fill this hole with epoxy, but I really didn't want the look of just a round epoxy circle in the middle of my bench top, so I'm going with the slightly more time involved, but I think better looking option. Unfortunately, given the size of this hole, I knew I wasn't going to be able to actually make it completely disappear, but I knew that I'd be able to get close and hopefully make it at least not stand out. Now you might think that I'm going the extra mile here by filling this with wood rather than just epoxy, but in all reality, I took a shortcut even going this route. What I should have done if I really wanted to go over the top was to actually hand carve an oval-shaped plug for this hole, but I just frankly did not want to do that, so I'm using a little bit of sawdust and CA glue here just to make sure that all those gaps are filled appropriately, and I think it actually turned out pretty solid. There were a handful of other small imperfections on this bench top, but those were a lot less interesting, so I did not film those, so we will move on. The next step on this bench top is to add a big edge profile, and I'm going to be using a cove router bit to do this. It may be a strange analogy in your mind, but I've compared edge profiles in the past to a haircut. Not everybody's going to notice them, but it does contribute a lot to the overall look of the piece. This edge profile, however, is kind of the equivalent of getting a mohawk, because everybody's going to notice it. I must admit, I've never actually seen somebody use this edge profile. Not to say that hasn't been done, I personally haven't seen it, which means that it's either a really good, inspired idea, or it's gonna look terrible, and it was a poor decision. So we're gonna find out, but I'm liking it so far. Oh, and also, what we're looking at is the bottom of the bench top. That thin portion is actually gonna be the top. With the bench top all wrapped up and sanded all the way up to a silky 180 grit, it was time to turn our attention back to the base, and we need to do some joinery for this. This middle stretcher between the two sides of the base is actually going to end up being one of my favorite details on this piece, but the first step was to create a traditional mortise and tenon joint. There are about a million different ways to create a traditional mortise and tenon joint, but I typically end up using a combination of power tools and hand tools to get it all dialed in. Basically, I hog out the excess with the power tools and then hone it down to its final shape with hand tools like this chisel right here. A mortise and tenon joint is actually one of the strongest joints in woodworking, but that is only if you follow the correct rules, and one of the rules, well, I think the only rule, is the rule of thirds, and I did not follow that one bit here because I messed up my math, and unfortunately I didn't want to go back and fix it. So this is not the strongest mortise and tenon joint you're ever going to see, but once you see the final glow up, it's really not going to matter. It's going to do the job just fine. So all you woodworking purists can relax. The world will continue to spin, I promise. Assuming you're not a woodworking purist that I just brutally offended, and you're actually enjoying this video, I would definitely appreciate a subscription to my channel. Really helps me grow this channel and continue to put out content like this. So if you enjoy watching me build stuff and yap for 15-20 minutes, well, subscribe because it'll help me do that. Bad proportions aside, this mortise and tenon joint is actually very well executed for my standards, so I hope you enjoy it. I mentioned earlier that this stretcher actually ended up being one of my favorite details on this piece, and that is actually true, but it's born out of necessity, not really some grand design idea. I needed a way to make the transition between the base and the stretcher somehow look right, and the only thing that came to my mind was this actually tapered, hand-carved detail. This consistent taper that I'm adding to the stretcher is kind of a difficult detail to add with just an angle grinder, but fortunately I'm able to use my orbital sander to actually get it honed down to its final shape rather than having to hand sand for hours on end. It is a lot easier said than done to get a big chunk of wood to sit evenly on the ground and not have the bench rock back and forth, so what I'm doing here is actually decreasing the surface area that's going to be touching the ground by hogging out some material in the middle. Unless you have very flat floors, it's never going to be as stable as a standard 4-leg design, but it will make it a whole lot better. If you're one of those people that has a weird aversion or phobia of texture, don't worry, this will be on the floor so you'll never have to see it again. Earlier, I mentioned that I was going to have to buy a little bit of wow factor for this piece, and I really meant it. When I was designing this piece, I was going back and forth about whether I should add some sort of brass element to this design. It wasn't so much a question of whether it would look good or not, because I was pretty sure that it would. I mean, walnut and brass is like an age-old combination. The reason I was going back and forth is because this brass bar set me back about 75 bucks, and that kind of just felt like a lot for a little hunk of brass, but ultimately I think you'll agree that this was the absolute correct decision. I believe brass is actually soft enough to be able to be cut with just normal woodworking tools, but something about that kind of freaked me out and I didn't want to mess up the cut, so I relied on my trusty old handsaw. This one is super premium, by the way, and just put a little bit of sweat equity into getting this thing cut down to size. Because of the time and money that I put into this brass rod detail, I wanted to make sure that I was definitely going to show at the end of the piece, so I'm putting it at the bottom of the base so that whenever you're looking at it, no matter from what angle, you can pretty much see that, and that can be a really fun focal point. The footage of gluing up the stretcher and the brass rod actually looked terrible because it was at night, so just trust me that it was a little bit stressful, but we got it done. We do have one more thing to take care of before moving on to the finishing stage of this piece. I really wanted to avoid having any sort of visible fasteners on this piece, so in order to do that, I'm going to actually be cutting a recess into the bench top in order for the base assembly to sit inside of it. I must admit, sometimes my mind wanders when I'm doing these sort of mindless tasks. I mean, I shouldn't because this blade is spinning at thousands of rotations per minute, but the thing that I was thinking about this whole time that I was routing out these grooves is technically, I believe this is another mortise and tenon joint. I just now looked up the definition and here's what we got. A mortise is a hole or groove in which something is fitted to form a joint. A tenon is a projection inserted to make a joint. It definitely feels incorrect saying this, but this joint is exactly the same joint that you saw earlier in this build. I'm open to a counter argument from all you woodworking experts out there, but I'm not gonna lie, I think my mind is made up on this one already. With all the actual hard work behind us, it was time to move on to the actual fun part of this build, which is applying the finish. For this bench, I'm going to be using a hard wax oil finish. Unlike a film finish like a polyurethane or a lacquer, this finish that I'm going to be applying actually bonds to the wood itself. Because of this, it's really important to clean the wood thoroughly to make sure that no little bits of sawdust are still on it and that the finish is binding to the piece itself rather than just loose sawdust. Not to say that I dislike the other parts of woodworking, in fact I like pretty much all of them aside from sanding, but applying finish is always really fun because you actually start to see the fruits of your labor start to come to life. Walnut is a very popular wood, but it is very stale brown all the way up until you put the finish on it. And as you can see right here, it is going from stale, ugly, and boring to just like a vibrant, beautiful wood color. Rubio Monaco looks great, and it's a super easy finish to apply. I mean, I'm pretty sure that any one of you watching this video could figure out how to apply this finish. So it's great if you're doing things in the backyard, but one drawback is that when you're operating in high heat like it is here, I mean, it's I think 90 degrees and still humid outside, it started to seize up on me really fast, way faster than it should. So I was working as fast as I possibly could in order to get this finish applied, and fortunately was able to get it done just right. Rubio Monaco does have one bit of kryptonite, and that is the fact that it is such a matte finish that sometimes it leaves the wood looking a little bit more dead than you'd like. So I'm trying out this new product of theirs. I think it came out about a year or so ago, but it is called the Rubio Monaco Sheen Plus, and it's supposed to add a whole new level of sheen and bring this up to more of a satin level. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, so I can say whatever I want, and to be honest, I was a little bit skeptical that this was not going to work, but as you can see there, it brought a whole new level of sheen to this and honestly looked so much better. The sunlight hitting this makes it a little bit more dramatic than it actually was in person, but the fact remains, it brought it up from a matte to very much a gentle satin, which is exactly what I was going for on this piece. This final step is one of the most important on the entire build, and I actually kind of messed it up on the first case. I thought I was going to spray a lacquer on it, but it ended up making it look like fake brass, which is really sad because I bought real brass. To fix that, I ended up sanding it back down to a raw brass and decided to do a polished mirror-like finish. Metalworking really isn't my thing, so I had to watch a few YouTube videos on this, but the process is actually pretty simple. You start with a lower grit sandpaper. This one I'm using a 600 grit to start out, and actually wet sand all the way up through the grits. I think we get up to 5,000 grit if I remember correctly. It might have been 3,000. But either way, you get it up to a really high grit and then use a polishing compound in order to get it to be that mirror-like finish. With the wet sanding completed, it was time to move on to the polishing of the brass. I didn't learn this myself until a few weeks ago as I was building this piece, but polish is actually just an ultra fine abrasive, so that's why you'll see that dark color coming up. That's actually part of the brass coming off, and it's leaving that mirror-like finish behind. This is what the polished side versus the unpolished side looks like, and it is honestly a night and day difference. And with that, we move on to the beauty shots of this piece. Obviously, the circumstances of this build was not ideal, but I love how it turned out. Fortunately, this will be my one and only attempt at building furniture in a backyard, as I'll be back in my shop for the next build. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video and I really appreciate your time, and I hope you'll catch me on the next video.